Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone who has joined us at Texas Christian University today. We welcome famed novelist and TCU graduate Sue Monk Kidd. Sue, I can't tell you how proud we are of you and the powerful stories that you tell. I'm Mary Ann Roth, Associate Vice Chancellor of Communications at TCU, and I'll be moderating. Today, we'll be talking with Sue about her time at TCU and her journey to become one of the most celebrated writers of our time. And of course, we will discuss her most recent novel, a New York Times bestseller now in paperback, The Book of Longings. Later in the conversation, Reverend Russ Peterman, Senior Minister of Fort Worth University Christian Church, will join us to ask a few questions. And by the way, Russ is also a Horned Frog, class of 1990. Also joining us later is Dr. Tish Duncan, Assistant Professor of Religion at TCU's Adwan College of Liberal Arts. She teaches a class on women in early Christianity and writes on early Christian fiction. Dr. Duncan was in attendance when TCU conferred an honorary Doctor of Letters degree to Sue Monk Kidd in 2016, who has also received our Distinguished Alumni Award. Most importantly, we are here to meet Sue Monk Kidd. Thank you for being here with our community and the readers of TCU Magazine and our TCU alumni.
Well, I'm really feeling honored and privileged to be here. It is such a happy thing for me to be part of the TCU community, especially as the class of 1970, 50 plus years. So I want to thank you for having me today, and I'm excited about the conversation.
Very good. TCU has over 94,000 alumni, and several of them submitted questions about your time at TCU. I'd like to start with those. So tell us the story of how you came to be a Horned Frog.
Well, I should start by saying that I was born in a little town in Georgia, population 3,500. So TCU was far flung from my little world. Where I grew up, and all of my family, my father, my three brothers, nieces, nephews, cousins, distant cousins, all went to the University of Georgia. So I was a departure, and it happened like this. I went to the Medical College of Georgia my freshman year, and I met a young man named Sandy Kidd. We did something a little crazy. We got married when I was 20 years old in the middle of my college education. I feel like this story needs to come with a warning label, like young women, don't try this at home or something. But that's the kind of crazy thing we did in the 1960s, I guess. So at that ripe old age, I got married. And my husband was going off to graduate school. And so I did a deep dive research of all the colleges in the United States that offered BS degrees in nursing. And I came up with one that I thought was the very best, and that was TCU in Fort Worth, Texas, a place I had never been. I had never been to Texas. And my husband was able to find a graduate school in Fort Worth. And so that's how I became a Horned Frog. And it's something that, well, it was one of the best things I ever did.
For sharing that. That's a wonderful story. You mentioned that this is a special year for your class of 1970. They call it the medallion year, medallion ceremony. And so you're a year late because of COVID. But you came up with some of your classmates and their remembrances as a nursing student. Do you have any memories about that time specifically?
Well, I wish I had more, and I think that has something to do with it being 50 plus years ago. But I do have some vivid memories, particularly of being in nursing classes. I mean, I remember a very intense, multidisciplinary, rigorous classes. I remember some of my professors, like, I had to think through this, but Dr. Mildred Hogstall and Phoebe Lufgren and Ruth Sperry, and my favorite teacher, maybe I shouldn't have a favorite, but I did, was Catherine Nichols, who did the psychiatric rotation. And I remember once she said to me, you really are a storyteller, aren't you? We were writing in-depth case studies of patients at John Peter Smith Hospital and at a private psychiatric institute. And she said that to me, and I said, well, I hope so. And she said, oh, trust me, you are. So that was a kind of hint that maybe a look at the future for me. But I have great memories of classes there, and also not even in nursing classes. I remember going to chapel at 11 o'clock. I remember religion class where I sat behind Mr. TCU, Norm Boulash. He was Mr. TCU that year. And he was a big famous football star. And I remember in the margins of his, now why would I remember this? I don't know. In the margins of his composition book were little football plays with X's and O's and things like that, which impressed me. I think it was because my husband was impressed that I was sitting behind Norm Boulash. There were some great experiences. I mean, I felt like that year of 69, 70, there was an air of protest on the campus that I hadn't noticed before. I remember going to a vigil for the Kent State students. I remember signs that students held up in protest, things like quit killing us. So it was in memory of the Kent State students who were killed. So, I have a lot of wonderful memories of being there, and I cherish every one of them.
That sounds really formative, that last experience specifically. And I think that comes through in your writings and telling stories for people that may not be able to tell their own stories. Speaking of, TCU Magazine did a really insightful profile of you and the Book of Longings in our recent winter issue. For our guest, we're going to drop that link in case you haven't read it. But in the same vein, you graduated TCU, obviously, with a nursing degree. But it sounds like you had hints along the way that you were a writer and a storyteller. And maybe you knew that you always had that calling. We had several questions come in from all over, asking about how your academic career at TCU helped form your approach to research and preparation. I think Book of Longings took over 4 years for you to research. And so this is a rigorous process. Can you tell us about it?
Well, I should start by saying the truth of the matter is I wanted to be a writer from the time I was very small. And I grew up with my father telling these rather outlandish stories to my 3 brothers and myself about, well, stories that kind of cast a magical spell. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to create stories that would cast that kind of spell. And I always wanted to be a writer. Now, when I got in high school, and it came time to pick a college and a career, more or less, I told my guidance counselor that I wanted to be a writer. And she said, well, that's very admirable, but I suggest you do something a little more traditional. Women need to have something to fall back on in case something happens to their husbands. Now, did I mention this was in the pre-feminist South? So I was an enculturated Southern girl, and so I took her advice, kind of disappointed, but took her advice. Now, the summer I was 16, I worked at the local hospital, tiny little hospital in my hometown, as what I guess you would call a nurse's aides assistant. Never mind that I once broke a whole tray of glass thermometers, 28 of them, that I can still see the little balls of mercury rolling across the floor. Never mind that I had lots of problems with that, learning that. But nursing had a kind of mystique for me. I was enamored with it. probably because of that experience. And it may have had something to do with all those stories in all those hospital beds. So I picked nursing. And when I began that experience, I could not believe how really perfect it turned out to be for me, because it was very formative. I mean, when I think about it, nursing experiences at TCU as a student doing rotations at the Harris Hospital, I was introduced to births and death and suffering and pain and recovery and rejoicing and all the dynamics of a family around that experience. I mean, it was like being a first class eyewitness to some of the most dire experiences that human beings have. And we were taught to observe hidden things and to listen for things below the surface and to really record our observations. And it was just in many ways kind of perfect. And so I look back on that, even learning how to research so much. And I think of it as my necessary detour.
Absolutely. I love that. I think the compassion comes out, compassion that you probably helped develop as a nurse. But speaking of research and preparation, and those stories that you saw, you're known for shining a light for those who might not otherwise be seen. And so readers have asked what or who inspired you to write the Book of Longings?
I would say it was probably the character of Anna herself and how she appeared to me one day. A few years ago, I was reading an article in National Geographic magazine. It was about a fragment of an ancient papyrus in which Jesus referred to his wife, and it was introduced to the world by a Harvard professor. Now, it turned out to be a complete masterful fraud, a forgery. So that did not, however, make a dent in my determination to write this story, because the moment I read that, I imagined this young woman who was married to the figure of Jesus and what her life might have been like. And I was really sort of electrified by the whole idea. It didn't matter to me whether she really existed or not, because I don't know if Jesus had a wife. But what mattered to me was imagining it. And I felt like that was an important thing to do, was to imagine this. And it occurred to me, a couple of things occurred to me. One, if she really did exist, which maybe she did, maybe she didn't, she would be the most silenced woman in the world. And I had this burning need to give her a voice. I wanted her to have a voice. And the other thing that occurred to me was that I wondered, what would the world have been like if Jesus had been married? How would it be different? And I was pretty convinced it would be remarkably different. And I wanted to explore that too. So there were a lot of compelling reasons that I wanted to do it. And it started the very day she sort of stepped into my imagination.
Thank you. This book is one of my favorites, and I have to say I've read it twice myself. But friends have also said, and you can see in the chat, that it has reignited their faith or given them a reason to be engaged differently with the characters of the Bible as real people. And it has most certainly challenged the way we think. I want to talk about this all day, but I know that we have some guests waiting who would love to get into perhaps more theological questions as well. And we will address some of the questions that are coming in through the chat. But as I mentioned before, Dr. Russ Peterman is the senior pastor at University Christian Church here in Fort Worth. And Dr. Tish Duncan is an associate professor of religion at TCU. Her area of study is early Christianity. Thank you to both of you and welcome. Dr. Duncan, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. Sue, I love this book. And as I was reading your book, it was so interesting to know that Jesus would be crucified, but to wonder how that was going to feel from Anna's perspective. I read the gospel accounts every semester with my students, and I know those stories very well. But I must say that I was moved to tears when I saw that familiar scene afresh through Anna's eyes. So by allowing me to inhabit her perspective, you gave me a vantage point from which I had not seen those events before. And I wonder if you would say a bit about your decision as an author to write from that first person perspective.
Well, first I'll say that writing that particular scene was very intense for me, to say the least. I would have to get up from my desk and take a walk. It was so intense, probably more so than any scene I wrote in the novel. I've written every novel in the first person, and I choose to do that. I've actually tried to write in third person, and I can't do it very well. I long to write in first person, so I've just given into it. But I choose it because it gives me an intimate space, just what you were saying. And I feel that intimate space with the character is a sacred space. So for the reader, I hope, and certainly for the writer, because it plunges us into the character herself or himself. We get to see through her eyes and see the world through their lens, feel with their heart, experience everything intensely, personally. And that is often a way into the reader's identification. In other words, what I want as a writer is for the reader to identify with my character, become my character for a while. That's a very mysterious process. And the way to do that is to become the I in the story and let the reader become the I in the story. It took me a while to figure this out, but I think that the real value of literature, maybe the highest value, is the potential it has to create empathy in us. And the world needs a little bit of that, a lot of that, actually. And as I was saying, it's a kind of participation mystique in which you can become that character for a little while and feel new ways of feeling. And so that creates empathy in us. And that's the real value of reading, I believe. So you described it beautifully, Dr. Duncan. And I appreciate that so much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here and to be able to speak with you. Sue, as I read Anna's prayer, the prayer of her heart that she wrote in her bowl, bless the words that I write. May they be beautiful in your sight. May they be visible to eyes not yet born. And when I am dust, sing these words over my bones. She was a voice. I guess my question is, as a writer, as a person of faith, as a woman who has continually worked to find her own voice, how much of this book, or at least the character of Anna, is autobiographical?
I'll put it like this. When I finished the manuscript, well, no one reads this manuscript as I'm working on it, except for my daughter, who's my reader. When I finished, I handed it to my husband. By the way, it's the same husband I married when I was 20, so we managed over 50 years. I should add that. It worked out. But I handed him the manuscript, and he read it, and his first comment to me was, I see a lot of Anna in you and a lot of you in Anna. And it struck me suddenly that he was right, that I had probably written more autobiographically here than in any book I had written, maybe even more so than my nonfiction. And so I think that's pretty astute that you see that prayer. What I did was to think, what is the prayer in my heart? What lies at the bottom of my heart? The deepest prayer. What is it? Well, there it is. And so I wrote that. I actually told my husband, look, if you go before me, please, somebody say that prayer over my bones. And it's just what's in me. And I guess that's a very autobiographical prayer. But there are other aspects of the book too. I think one who knows me well, and maybe someone who's read my nonfiction or even my fiction, might see that Anna's spiritual and theological evolution in the story mirrors a lot of my own. Anna started out in a traditional Orthodox religion of Judaism in first century Galilee. And I started out in a Southern Baptist church in a little town in Georgia in the 1950s and 60s. So we evolved from there, both of us. We came to, well, I'll just put it with Anna. She learned that God could be freed from these narrow concepts that she had. In fact, one of the things she says in the novel is, let us free God. And I do think for me personally, it has been a freeing of my concepts that have been too caged, a kind of expansion, if you will, of my spirituality. Anna gave up, she let God give up the role of punisher and rescuer, and began to relate to God more as the God of being, of isness, of love, of inclusion, just that whole spirit of love. And that was true for me too. And I think the other way that was quite similar is that Anna began to relate not just to a masculine form of the divine, but a feminine form in the form of Sophia. And, I wrote a whole book on that, about the dance of the distant daughter, of my own journey of trying to balance that and find equilibrium, not only in my religion and culture, but internalized. So, there's similarities. Toward the end of the novel, there's a scene in which the leader of this community of Jewish philosophers, a woman named Skepsis, says, let us search for the God behind God. Now that has echoes of Paul Tillich, as you probably would recognize, who talked about the idolatry of our images somehow, that God is beyond gender and beyond so many things that we can imagine, but the God behind God. Now, all of these things play into the novel, but in the end, I think we find a personal way to relate, and I've done that. So yes, lots of autobiographical similarities, and I could go on about that,
Thank you.
The use of fiction to explore faith and history is not new for Christianity. My own research for quite some time now has focused on an early Christian novel from the 3rd or 4th century. And I often describe that work as revisionist historical fiction, because it seems to me that it wants to correct what it takes to be some misconceptions in the story of early Christianity as it's commonly known. Now, how do you think about that issue? What is the role of fiction in the life of faith, and especially when that faith is so deeply grounded in historical events?
Well, I think there's a definite role for fiction in our faith journeys. In fact, I think it's important to have it there. Imagination and history intersecting is a tricky thing. But if we can navigate that, I think something quite extraordinary can happen. Now, You said revisionist history. I think that the Book of Longings, in a way, is a revisionist history. I thought of it as an alternate fictional history, not all fictional, but some fictional history. And I thought of it as a reimagining or a retelling. Now, this is just, I have a little note on my desk that says, the role of the writer is to rewrite the world. That's all, just rewrite the world. And we do that often through alternate histories. I think when you do that, it gives us, the reader, a new way to see things and imagine and feel things. And in doing that, we realize what's possible. Oh, that is possible. We have to imagine not only in science, but in religion, the unimaginable. I always think of Thomas Merton, who was a great mentor to me through his writings, who said, the imagination needs time to browse around. Even in our faith journeys, we have to let that browse around, because it's so important to tell these stories in new ways that jolt the heart. Marianne, you mentioned empathy, and I think that role is often like the ability to have an ice axe on a frozen sea. Those are Kafka's words. But it's like that when we do an alternate history. It somehow awakes us or jolts us, because the familiar can become hidden. It becomes so familiar we don't see it anymore. So when we can reimagine stories and tell them through new lenses and in new ways, or imagine something alternate, it often just rewrites the world a little bit, sometimes individual worlds and sometimes even in the culture. So, it brings new mythology. So I totally believe in bringing imagination into the faith journey.
Thank you. That's a beautiful sentiment.
Speaking of, I'm going to jump in here. I know that Dr. Peterman and Dr. Duncan have other questions, but I wanted to take one from the chat because it fits in really nicely here with the idea of revisionist history and reimagining perhaps what could have been. But you have taken historical figures and woven them in really expertly. You have even taken historical events. I know that you reference the building of some of the Colosseums there, and what the role of a carpenter or a builder might have been with those. And you've moved the dates a little bit, but you've really made them work. The specific question that came in was about how you decided to link Anna with Judas as a brother.
Well, of course, we all know how the story of Jesus turns out. And Judas was going to be a figure in all of that. He's going to play a role. And I was really at a loss of how to introduce him into the story in a unique way. And one day it just occurred to me, why not just make him Anna's adopted brother? And then we have the most interesting and complex triangle between Anna, Jesus, and Judas. Anna loves them both, and Anna's going to see their stories and report them both. The thing about Judas, as a writer, you want to tell the humanity of every character the best you can. And that means giving them a little sympathy, giving them a reason, a motive. And I wanted to give Judas a reason for what he did, and taking cues from a lot of historical, biblical history. I imagined that there was a political theater going on here, and that Judas, I gave him a background where he was a zealot who had been deeply wounded because of how the occupation of Rome had created loss in his life of his parents. And he grew up revengeful and with a deep hate of Rome. And this political stance of his colored everything. So we at least understood why he did what he did. Anna could not forgive it, but he did what he did. And I think it's good to just see all sides of that as best we can. So that's how he came into the picture it was just a stroke of imagination one day. And that way I could evolve Judas through Anna's eyes in his childhood and on.
So this book is clearly about Anna. It's her story told from her perspective. As a preacher, I was also compelled by the character of Jesus, who is given such a rich sense of humanness. And I once heard a New Testament scholar say that by and large, that as Christians, we struggle with the humanity of Jesus. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about the struggle that you may have encountered of creating this character that we all know so well in a new and authentic way.
Well, it was a struggle to try to figure out how to approach the character of Jesus. I mean, every now and then it would occur to me, what are you doing, Sue? You're writing the character of Jesus. You're putting words in his mouth. I didn't do this lightly, I can assure you. I thought about this deeply for a long time. The first thing that occurred to me was I wanted to talk about Jesus and peel away as much of the theological concepts as I could so that I could talk about the human Jesus. And that was quite an undertaking for me. I'm steeped in all of that. And then one day I was reading Dr. Marcus Borg's book, and he said something that struck me to the core. He said, we need to separate the pre-Easter Jesus from the post-Easter Jesus. That clarified it for me. I understood what I was doing suddenly. And, there is this pre-Easter human figure who was born around 4 to 6 AD, BC, excuse me, and then who died around 29 to 30 AD, a real person who lived and ate and walked and drank and laughed. That's the Jesus I wanted to talk about and write about. And Borg made a comment that I feel is really true. He said that we have so emphasized the deity of Jesus that we have somehow lost touch with his humanity. And that in doing that, we had really lost something. I mean, of course, Jesus was an extraordinary human, pre-Easter Jesus. And we think of him as having the fullness of God, an incarnational life, the fullness of God in this life that he lived when he was human. So if we lose touch with that, it seems to me we lose touch with our own ability to envision humans doing this. And so to reclaim this humanness of Jesus is crucial, I think, to our faith. And it's something that a lot of people have written to me about and said, why, I haven't thought of Jesus as human, or I discovered Jesus as human and by reading this book. And I must say, I rediscovered Jesus as human by writing it.
Mm-hmm. Along those same lines, this having Jesus as a married man, that probably required some bravery. That there may have been some pushback from some folks. I'm wondering if you could talk about the process and the kind of feedback that you've received from that.
Yes. Well, of course, there's some pushback. When I wrote The Dance of the Dissident Daughter, I jumped fully into the world of controversy. So it wasn't new to me. And I learned then, many years ago, back in 1996, how to navigate that boat when it's rocking. And I learned a lot from that experience. So when I decided to write this book, it was with a bit of trepidation, but mainly I was so compelled to do it. I knew this was my book to write. I knew I was supposed to write it. And that gave me a lot of courage. I'll say this too, that the lost feminine within religion was motivating for me. The lost stories of women, the silencing of women, the lack of stories in the Bible compared to men. I mean, what if women had been the storytellers? So all of those things were compelling for me, that lostness of the feminine, and that made me brave. There's a line in the novel in which Anna says something like, "The anger made me brave and the grief made me sure." I realized I was writing about myself again. The anger made me brave and the grief made me sure. And so it never really rocked my boat. It was there, but I have to say it wasn't overwhelming at all. Mostly what I received was an outpouring of support for this book and this story, and women and people whose lives were impacted by it. And I've heard some extraordinary stories about it. But, they're out there, those who found this to be a bridge too far, and I understand that, and I respect that.
One thing that I really loved in your book is the way that in that crucifixion scene again, you really lifted up the role of the women, and they are very consistently prominent in the gospel accounts, but we don't have a full picture of what they were doing. And I thought you brought us into that just so beautifully, and you brought in a number of named characters. It made me wonder, you gave it Mary Magdalene, the famous Mary, a sort of cameo. I wonder if you have another book in you from Mary's perspective, perhaps.
Probably not. I don't know. I can't even imagine right now. But I think Mary, a lot of people ask me, why wasn't Jesus married to Mary Magdalene? A lot of people imagine it that way. And that is precisely why I didn't do it that way. I mean, for a couple of reasons. I wanted to have the fresh canvas. I wanted to come at it in an utterly new way. And also to fill in those lost years of Jesus. I mean, that's a kind of blank canvas. And from the time he was 12 until around 30, we don't really have a record. So what if he did marry early, as most Jewish men did? Not most, all Jewish men married around 20 or so. It was almost mandatory to take your place in the Jewish world and in the community and in the religion. And in fact, being celibate was almost a sin at the time. Married life, be fruitful and multiply, was what Jewish men were about. So it seemed to me maybe Jesus followed the dictates of his religion and did that, and did it early, and perhaps something happened to her that we didn't see her in the gospel record. So that's the way I imagined it, which seemed to me more plausible.
So as one reads your entire collection of work, it's easy to see an evolution of sorts. You've taken a journey, a discovery of growth. In a lot of ways, your work helps your readers take that journey as well. I'm curious how this book impacted your faith journey.
Well, it did impact it. My daughter and I, Ann Kidd Taylor, wrote a book together called Traveling with Pomegranates. And in that book, I tell the story of standing in the narthex of the cathedral in Athens, Greece. And as I was standing there, this young woman came in, and as part of the Greek Orthodox religion, she bent over and kissed an icon of Jesus. And she left a big lipstick smear right on his cheek. And I remember watching this with great nostalgia, thinking how I had so evolved in my spirituality that I had lost that ability to bend over and kiss the icon of Jesus like she had and feel what she was obviously feeling. And I went over and took that in, that lipstick imprint on his face. And it came to me, quite honestly, after I finished writing this book, that it was my kiss on the icon. It was an experience of kind of returning to not just the humanity of Jesus, but the impact of his life, the importance of that compassion and love, and those things that I tried to identify in the story. So, I think it did have an effect on my faith journey. I wondered if I would be brave enough to tell it initially, but I once stenciled some words on the wall of my stairwell to my study, which were writing is an act of courage. And I really believe that. I think that writing every day is just a lot of small daily braveries that we do. And writing a married Jesus, a human Jesus, kissing that icon again, that was an act both of courage for me, but also of love.
We have a question from Facebook about why you chose the word longings for the title over something like dreams or hopes. And I'm wondering if that question might connect up with something I'm wondering as well. If you might have any words of advice for my students at TCU now, the world that they're facing after they graduate and as they think about what they want to do with their own lives. Feel free to answer any part of that if you like.
Well, longings is a word I love. It's a word that has always fascinated me. And when I was trying to come up with a title for the book, when I wrote, it felt like 500 titles before I found this one. And the minute I wrote it, I knew that was it. Longings to me tell us everything about ourselves. There's a line in the book actually where Anna's Aunt Yatha, who's her mentor and her spiritual midwife, so to speak, the one who encourages her audacities, so to speak, she says to Anna, "Return to your longings. They will teach you everything." Now, I feel like that our longings are one of the more eloquent ways the soul speaks to us. Jung said, if you want to find your life work, follow your fascination. We could say, follow your longings. And the other thing I would say to your students is, just from my own experiences, take the necessary detour if you have to. But always come home. And sometimes how to come home because you get homesick for yourself. And that longing starts to talk to you. And we should listen, because whatever that longing is, that's the prayer at the bottom of the heart that you put in the incantation bowl and carry with you. And it's always speaking. It's the soul speaking.
Beautiful. There was another question that came in from one of the people listening. To create Anna, did you consider or draw on inspiration from other women in the Bible, somebody like Mary, Elizabeth, Esther, Sarah, any of those folks?
Not so much. Maybe I was influenced somewhat by some of the fiercer female characters in the Bible. Anna, you're right when you said it's her story. Jesus is more or less a secondary character. It's Anna's quest, and Anna is ambitious. She's brave. She's beyond her time. She's fierce. And so I tried to look at examples in the Bible, but mostly I would say 95% of her is just conjured up. And I believe women like her existed at the time. I know they did, because I know women. And I don't think there is a time frame for when we stop wanting to be free and have the freedom and opportunities our brothers have or our fathers have. And I think that longing were in women, and some of them, it was so clear, and they had the kind of personality that wanted to pursue that. And the other thing about Anna is she needed to have a kind of luminous largeness to herself in order to be a partner to Jesus. And so I tried to draw her character in that way, as full of longings, full of passion, and full of bravery.
To follow up on that, one of the other characters that I found most intriguing and compelling in this story was Yatha, who you mentioned a moment ago as sort of her mentor. In some ways, sort of gave her that sense of courage. I was wondering if you could talk about her.
She was one of the most wonderful characters I ever came upon. In my writing, I had more fun writing her than maybe any other character, because she was older, she was wise, she was, I think I described her as having a feral mind that spilled its borders, and she trespassed everywhere. So she did inspire a lot of Anna's bravery. She went with Anna throughout the entire story. She was the one who helped to teach Anna, but also learned from Anna. And she had her own secrets. I mean, a lot of the plot, secondary plot, revolves around Yatha. She was literate, educated, as very few women were at the time, came from Alexandria in Egypt, a city where the Jewish community was very vibrant and had a little more freedoms than they did in Galilee. And she was just great to write because she didn't take much off of people. I mean, she spoke her mind. She drew the line. She knew what she was about. And she was kind of a role model. I have some Yathas in my life. I think the thing I love is that Anna was blessed by Yatha. Yatha would say, "I bless the largeness in you, Anna." And I think we all need that. We need someone to see the largeness in us, because we all have it. We all have our own particular genius, and we need someone to bless it, multiply it. And I have 3 Yatha figures in my life like that, who are my friends. I call them my Trinity of Yathas now. And we meet every year for the last 20 years, and we bless one another's largeness. And it's a beautiful way to have a spiritual community, actually.
Can I ask one more thing on behalf of myself as a writer and on behalf of my students in the work that they do at TCU? Can you share with us a little bit about your practice of research and writing? How do you cultivate the inspiration, the courage, and the discipline to get it done?
Writing for me is both discipline or measure or technique, craft. And on the other hand, it's mystery and madness and all the things we can't really, it's an art. So I try to bring those two things together. When I start a book, I do a collage, and that's a little bit of the mystery for me. I haven't written anything yet, but I have an idea of the story, and I do an old-fashioned collage, and I take time with it, and I let my unconscious gravitate toward images that visualize certain things for me. Sometimes I won't know why I'm putting this particular image into a collage. I've done one for every novel I've written. I remember putting a pink house in the collage I did for The Secret Life of Bees, wondering why I did that, and a wall, a Jewish wailing wall, and other things that then sprouted story. So I think sometimes if you're a very visual person, you can create a kind of storyboard of images that will actually, if you play with the image, it will sprout. It really will, if it fascinates you. And so a whole board of collage of these images is very rich and textured way to picture story, and I like to picture it. Then I start making timelines and character studies. I mean, I do all of this sort of stuff nobody wants to do, trying to see the whole picture as best I can. I work with something called, this is maybe more technical than we need to go, but something called Aristotle's incline. You can look it up on the internet. It's an actual way of a kind of backbone for a novel. And I find it very helpful for picturing the novel. So I do a lot of work ahead of time before I start the actual writing. I create a little clothesline where I hang scenes on a clothesline. All of that background work creates the raw material for me. And then I start writing, trying to put language and music to all of this. And the thing that caution against, I guess, is to allow yourself to, again, detour from what you've created, because the story will always surprise you. So you create a loose structure and then let yourself leave it when you need to, or revise it when you need to. And I am a slow writer. Maybe this is why, as I'm telling all this, I'm thinking, why are you so slow? There it is. But I think I revise a lot. The real writing of the book happens when I rewrite it and revise it. So it's a long process of mystery and measure.
We just had another great question that came in about the parables that came alive as a result of your weaving these stories into the characters' lives. The question came up: how did you conceptualize those stories?
I wanted to throw in certain stories, parables that are recognizable, most of them, to people that might suggest where Jesus came up with these things. I mean, I kind of felt like there was some experience in his background from which he created these stories. Some of them were fully imagined. Some of them perhaps he had seen or heard, or he drew from his own memories and things that were happening around him. So, there was the woman who was stoned. I won't give away who that was, but there was the Good Samaritan. I had these things actually happening to him, which later, when he began his ministry, he would tell as parables. I'm trying to remember some of the other ones. The woman who washed the feet of Jesus, that was an actual gospel experience, not a parable. Consider the lily, some of the sayings of Jesus. He talked with Anna about that. It was something that he would say to her. So I tried to take all of these little bits and pieces from his life and from gospel experience and sort of weave them through the story as something that was part of the whole fabric of Anna's life.
So one last question. When I was in seminary, I was told that it's not just important to read theologians and scholars and poets, but also to read what they are reading. We are all here in part because you're one of our favorite writers. I'm just curious, who are some of your favorites? And what are you reading these days?
Well, I'll tell you some of my favorites. The work of Marilyn Robinson. And I noticed I think it was this week, Oprah picked her Gilead series, which I love very much. I think it's a quartet of books, which are beautifully written. She's one of my favorite. Also, Barbara Kingsolver's The Poisonwood Bible, The Bean Tree, which is probably my favorite one of her books. I love the work of Alice Hoffman. Her last books about the Jewish experience, about the uprising in Israel. There's so many. The poets I love, David White. I read his poems like little meditations. Sometimes they're the best scripture that I read. Sometimes I read the work of Rumi or Hafiz. I mean, they're just, poetry for me is a way into the soul. Reading can be like a prayer, you know.
Sure.
And right now I'm reading, I like to read fiction, nonfiction, biography, memoir. I like to read across the board. Probably my favorite thing to read is literary fiction. But right now I'm reading a book that will be coming out next fall that I'm writing the foreword for, which is called, you should maybe look for this because I think it's a remarkable book. It's called After Jesus, Before Christianity. And it's by a group of scholars who are historical Jesus scholars. And so I'm having an interesting time reading that and trying to think what to say about all this.
Thank you.
I do not want to be the one who brings this to a close, and yet I think I must. This has been an incredible hour. I do want to leave some time for Sue to make the closing comments, but this has been an incredible hour. We are so grateful for your time. It really, truly feels like the beginnings of a symposium on all these topics because I will say that the questions have continued to pour in about your inspirations and about happenings in the books. I mean, I can't tell you how action-packed the book is. There's a pandemic, which was especially relevant to us perhaps right now. There, stories of sexual assault and other really painful experiences, but all beautifully woven into this story. Special thanks to our guest, Dr. Peterman and Dr. Duncan. We are very grateful to our friends at the TCU Alumni Association. They've co-hosted and also, of course, the TCU Magazine. Please always look at TCU Magazine when you get a chance. Before I turn it over to Sue to make closing comments, I'd like to thank also our neighbors at University Christian Church, to the TCU campus store where you can get your copy of the Book of Longings and every Sue Monk Kid title. A recording of this will be available on whatever channel you're looking at it now. To listen to or share today's event, as well as other content from the alumni group and TCU Magazine, subscribe to our podcast. Sue, it has been a true honor and a pleasure having you with us today. We appreciate you inspiring the next generation of leaders and for broadening our worldview. Thank you very much.
Well, the honor, believe me, the honor is all mine. I can't tell you how much it meant to me to be able to do this today, and to be part of all of this was extraordinary. And I want to thank TCU, TCU Magazine, TCU Alumni. And I have to say, the TCU Alumni has got to be the greatest alumni association I've ever seen. I remember when I spoke in Dallas some years ago. I think it was with the invention of wings. That auditorium was packed with TCU graduates who told one another about it. And I was so grateful. It was just so wonderful to have all of those horned frogs out there. And I want to thank everyone for supporting my work. And most of all, I just want to say, keep reading.
Thank you.